If not you, then who? If not now, then when? And through that, I put my hand up to go through a very difficult process, which found me being elected onto the main boards in the UK. And through being on the board, I challenged the firm to do more on the ESG. And that challenge was thrown back to me to say, well, why don't you do it? Why don't you lead on this? So, so some years ago, I took on the ESG lead role in the UK and subsequently was asked to take this on globally. So that's my personal story, and I didn't know you were going to ask that, so thank you very much.
Thank you for sharing that. And I'd like to come back to you on the subject of building trust within teams, but let me first ask our other panelist, Justin Wu, to answer the same question.
Okay, so
how did you get here? Why does it matter to you?
Thank you. Yeah, I did know you were going to ask that question, Angela, but I'm not sure I have a better answer. About 20 years, just under 20 years ago, I started working for a British entrepreneur named Michael Liebreich. Some of you might know him if you search on the internet, but essentially he started a clean energy venture sort of company. Oh, okay, better? Yeah, thanks. Thanks. That was looking at basically investment in clean energy trends about 20 years ago, when basically nobody was talking about it, right? So 20 years ago, if you go talk to any energy company in the world or any bank or equity analyst, if you say, do you know what clean energy is? They might say, oh, I'm not really sure what it is, and that sort of thing. So anyway, make a long story short, the company eventually got acquired by Bloomberg, and then about a year ago I was hired by HSBC, but essentially this became a very big topic. So I sort of started looking at sort of technologies that were designed to mitigate climate change before people started talking about the topic. But now it's become very mainstream. So it's very interesting to see how this sort of evolved. And I think we'll talk about it a bit more, but the sort of the what and the how and the why, I think, has really evolved over this period of time. But I think a few things have really stayed the same all through this time. And I think that's really important for us to keep in mind as we look at this topic going forward.
Thank you for sharing. I have seen this trend in many different industries over the last 10, 15 years that I've been in social impact. And it really comes down when a leader personally gets invested in this journey that you see huge change in policies and in the way companies approach the subject of sustainability and all its complexities. So John, back to you on the subject of building teams. You had a slide up there that talked about buy-in, how it takes a lot of time to build trust, but you can lose it in an instant. So for those of us who are looking to start building our teams or who need to continue innovating those teams, tell us a little bit about that. What does that look like? Who needs to be in the room? And any tips on getting buy-in? Excuse me.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Angela. And I think actually your question, the way in which you framed it, summed it up really nicely about leadership and having authentic leadership tone from the top. That is really the first step. I work with clients all around the world, and some of the biggest businesses around the world, and you see those actually personally committing to this, and they all have a story. They all have a story. Quite often, it could be about the legacy that they want to leave for their children. It could be in a world whereby we have lived and travelled so much. It could be that they've been personally impacted. I've been in a hurricane, not once, but twice, personally. So it's the tone from the top and that authenticity. That's really important. Having a clear and coherent external message. This is why we talk a lot about communications and how you articulate this. But it's really important having that external message matched with internal comms and action. And what I mean by this, external rhetoric is not enough, without what this mean for individuals in the organization. So what I mean by that, what does this mean for the finance function? What does it mean for, our procurement function? Absolutely every part of the organization. So to your point, in terms of who needs to be in a room, well, it's actually representatives of the whole business. And by whole business, I mean that at a fully inclusive level. So that means at a functional level, finance, HR, procurement, at a divisional level, ASPAC, EMA, and so on. And it also means that from a gender perspective, and also from a generational perspective. I talk a lot about the fact that whilst we're here taking decisions for what happens in the future, we will not be the people in the future who will really bear the main consequences of climate change. So we need that generational side. So tone at the top, ensuring that it's authentic, external comms matched with internal specifics in terms of how you drive change.
So just to clarify, it sounds like a conversation or an initiative that not just the CEO can drive. It sounds like the entire C-suite needs to get together and figure out how do we get these people in the same room and set an agenda, a meeting cadence in order to really get this conversation going.
Spot on. That's spot on.
Thank you. Justin, I'd like to ask you about another sort of like common myth or confusion point, which is ESG versus climate change. They're used interchangeably a lot. Are they different? Should we look at them differently?
I think John's presentation actually answered the question in the beginning, but I really like the way you framed it, John, actually, which is the E is the what, the G is the how, and the S is the why, right? So I would say it's very much like that. The what is, well, climate change is a major catalyst, right, of what's happening. It's previously we try to do things, we think about, okay, we need to grow and we need to sort of invest and do these things, but climate change has basically made it so that this is something that we need to, in some ways, fix or mitigate, right? And by the way, I don't think it's useful to think of it as an either or, right? In the sense that somehow there's some kind of trade-off between mitigating climate change versus growth or something like that. I think that's probably the biggest myth that we have, which is the $275 trillion we see here is somehow in addition to whatever else we need to do. I once, I think, at a panel got this question from somebody, I definitely won't name who and where this came from. When these numbers came out, they said, oh my God, 200 trillion or some $1 trillion, where are we going to find that money? Do you know there's still world hunger we have to solve, right? And I said, well, how much money do you think the world invests every year in infrastructure and development and agriculture and everything else and health and everything we do, right? Probably somewhere in that number or trillions and trillions of dollars. We simply have to make sure that money is aligned with mitigating climate change and all the other ESG goals that we have set out. That's what it is. It's not either or, it's just one thing, right? And I think that's really an important point to say. So the other thing I will say is that I think climate change is a major catalyst, and it really does need to be something that is our, kind of a goal that we have in mind, because we really have a very sort of small opportunity to do something about it. Because if we don't fix this, then actually none of the other stuff really will matter in the end, because it's very hard to fix everything else. But I think ESG is what grounds us, right? It makes us, ensures that when we do this, we do it right? That we don't sort of, because you can build a battery factory for electric vehicles and you can damage the environment or have horrible labor practices while doing it. But since we have an opportunity to build something new, why don't we do it right? Why don't we do it with fair labor practices, good governance, and make sure the environment's not polluted while we're investing in this new factory that's going to mitigate climate change, right? It's sort of having that goal in mind, which is mitigating climate change or adapting, but ensuring that we have the right standards and doing it right. And by doing it right, actually, it's a better outcome overall for all involved.
It's hard to think that anyone would not want to establish a business or continue a business with fair labor practices or be doing things right. Do we still see this in the supply chains, in the workplace? And what do we see more specifically in Japan, like going well versus not going well? Are there areas where we're succeeding in well, or our sort of Japanese approach is doing us well versus the West?
Yeah, it's a big question, that one. I think there's a couple of angles to look at it, and I think on one hand, a lot of Japanese companies are, broadly speaking, I think are fairly aligned to international standards, right? A lot of Japanese companies have been very quick to sign up to various standards globally and sort of, you probably can tell me this better, but be sort of more aligned on international standards when it comes to reporting or governance and other things. And I think that part is going reasonably well, but of course there's a lot more that sort of can be done, right? One example I can take from clean energy is, the RE100 membership, which is a group of companies which have subscribed to using 100% renewable energy for their operations. And Japan is actually leading by miles in Asia in terms of the number of companies that have signed up to this. But this example might sort of illustrate the situation, is that although a lot of companies in Japan have signed up, more than their peers across Asia, they haven't really come up with a plan of how to get it done. So they sort of set a goal for 2050, 20 or 30 years later, and then sort of ask the question, well, how do we get there? Whereas some of their peers in other Asian countries, China or India, et cetera, haven't set these goals and haven't actually subscribed to any of these standards. And you may look at it and say, well, that's not compliant, that's not good. But their actual use of renewable energy is a lot higher. They've actually done more, but they actually haven't set the goals and the standards. So it's one example, it's a very small example. There's obviously a lot out there, but I think that illustrates some of the situation here in Japan, in the sense that actually a lot more compliance and standards, a lot more goal setting and actually organization around it, but actual doing has been a little bit slower than their peers in other countries which actually have not actually set the goals officially.
That kind of reminds me of what you were saying, John, about that curve from resistance, acceptance, acceleration. Can you walk us through that a little bit? And if you have any insights on the cultural relevance, I imagine that arc might be different depending on which culture you're in, which country you're in. What should we be prepared for as companies as we look at that curve?
Yes, great question. And the reason why we took the time and went through the analysis of position this in the context of this curve is that we see that clients, many people, are struggling. They are struggling around this. So we took the time to overlay the transitional plan and the climate science on what is there is social sciences. So this is actually a social science based approach to driving transformational change. So on the curve, and we pulled out some of the big words, resistance and acceleration and so on. But at a deeper level, you can actually break this down to much more deeper level. So I talked about, during my presentation, enthusiasm. So you launch a commitment, you announce a commitment, and there's fanfare. And you can measure that level of enthusiasm through things such as sentiment analysis. So you measure that either through external or internal communications and sentiment analysis. Now, the enthusiasm in this case can actually go overboard. Yeah, we're going to do that, we're going to succeed, everything's wonderful, brilliant. But that will typically very quickly change to frustration once we get into the realities of what we actually need to do. When you talked about Japanese supply chains, a lot of the companies here, as you know very, very well, are global companies. So their supply chains are global in nature and have evolved over time. Unpicking that is incredibly difficult. So what you then do is you make the announcement, but you tailor your engagement plan and communication strategy based on actually, hey, this is happening, but I want to temper that and let you know these are the stages that we need to go through. And it's not going to be easy, and this is how we're going to continue to engage with you. And that engagement, to your point around the cultural element, ideally, what social sciences tells us is you would engage in a culturally sensitive way, and you will use change agents. Right? So right across my supply chain is a huge geographical spread. What I would do is I would understand who the change agents are, engage with them accordingly as they go through those curves. So really the reason why we took the time to frame it this way is fundamentally what we're positioning to leaders is say, look, don't be surprised by what's happening. This is consistent. We have a science-based approach to managing this. So actually what you should do is frame your engagement and your communication strategy in a way which is culturally sensitive and consistent with where we are on the transitional journey. Okay?
Yes, fascinating. So I'm understanding that a lot of this comes down to the real human element of the companies, right? Our leadership, our education within the companies. Follow-up question is,
Do you see most companies already having that leadership vision and those capabilities, or do they themselves, are they themselves now looking to upskill in order to enable the type of change journey that you're speaking to?
It depends. There are many companies out there still have a way to go. Actually, I really like how Justin framed one of his responses earlier. It's not either or, it's both and. And how I'd summarize this is that you see a degree of both and leadership, either or leadership. And what I mean by that is you exit from COVID. It's like, right, so it's all about, just getting things moving again from COVID. Then you have this terrible war in Ukraine. And then the focus there, well, it's all about energy security. So let's just focus on that. Then you have the filter through a cost of living. It's all about cost reduction. So you transition from one thing to the next, and what we see is almost leadership being buffeted by the waves, or themselves, their strategies are being driven by clicks. Clicks on news reports because it's the headline. This is what I need to focus on. I won't say who it was. I spoke to a very, very senior, person, because I challenged them on some of their rhetoric, and you see right now that everybody's talking about AI. And they said to me, of course we're going to talk about AI, because unless we do that, our share price is going to go down, so we have to talk about that. So we've seen it. So really, what we need our leaders to do is just to have that foresight, and instead of actually flipping from one subject to the next, as Justin alluded to this perfectly, is really that we see all our decisions through the lens of ESG, through a sustainable lens. So we're going to talk about AI, absolutely, but how can we actually implement our AI solutions in a way which drives the transition to a low carbon economy? I'm in a room now, which, I don't know about you guys, I'm feeling quite warm. Are you feeling warm? I'm feeling, it's quite warm, it's quite hot. I'm pleased that the curtain was drawn before, because when I stood there, the sun was right, pushing into my eyes. The reason why I reference this, last year I was in Sharm el-Sheikh at COP27, and I was on a panel with an incredible CEO from a company called Brainbox AI. One of the key things that I would suggest that you all really think about, buildings. All of our clients have built environment, buildings or offices or factories, decarbonisation of these. So he has invented some AI to drive the decarbonisation of buildings. So it is AI, but it is both and is consistent with achieving a low carbon economy.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. I'd like to jump quickly and ask Justin about the energy transition and the financing of this transition. So a little bit from the people side, straight into the logistics and the topic of energy.
Yeah, well, I think, just to add, I think the transformation, the people transformation is really important. To John's point, I think I fully echo that point. And I think to achieve everything that we do, what we're trying to do, when I speak from HSBC's perspective, for instance, I think that's, we talk a lot about embedding that within the bank, right? So I'll get to the energy transition. And one of the things that we need to do, so for instance, if you think about it as a bank, right, where we can have the most impact is how we work with our clients, right? The activities of our clients, the lending that we do to our clients, and what they do with that money, essentially, right? That's where we can have the most impact. Are they going to invest in more, coal or something, or are they going to do something that's not aligned to certain standards? Versus, can we sort of have some sort of influence upon them to make sure that they shift towards lower carbon sort of activities or technologies, right? So those sort of things is where we can kind of have a real economy influence, and that's energy transition, if you will, sort of our role to play in that. But to achieve that, it is about people, right? It is about sort of equipping, not just a top down. I mean, obviously our CEOs has been really dedicated to the topic, right, from the top. But what about embedding that throughout the bank, right? What about sort of making sure that all of our people, when they're when they're having that conversation with our client or making those lending decisions or that credit risk decision, all these sort of things, they have this lens in mind, right? Is it really a good idea to lend to a company, and this is hypothetical by the way, that has no plans for electric vehicles when faced with a 2030 or now 2035 internal combustion engine vehicle deadline in the world's third largest automobile market. It's probably not a good idea, right? That's not just an environmental climate change type risk, that's a huge credit risk, right? Or if a company has really very low transparency on a lot of its smaller suppliers, right, in palm oil or something in a part of the world. Is that really a good idea? Are we going to be subject to sort of extra scrutiny, right? So these sort of things, right? This is sort of your spider sense, if you will, right? That you have to sort of embed that within people to say, well, wait, that doesn't look right, right? That's a transition risk, that's a reputational risk, et cetera, et cetera. But at the same time, it's not all about risk management. That's a very important part of it, right? But it's also about seeking an opportunity, right? Does that company that looks very small and I'm not so sure about it, but they've got something really interesting that could play a really critical role in the energy transition, for instance, that's probably one we want to work with and go after, right? So this sense, I mean, it's not that sort of everybody, I think, everybody is going to be sort of looking at it exactly the same way, but I think this is what the organization, developing this lens is so important, because the more that we have it, the more we're able to achieve this. And it can't just be a few people at the top that sort of have this lens, right?
Can I just add on that? I'm absolutely delighted to be on this panel, Justin and HSBC, but we're also, as an organisation, delighted to work with HSBC through such initiatives as the Sustainable Markets Initiative, which is sponsored by King Charles in the UK, and HSBC are an absolute leader in that front. And what Justin has said is so important, because with a bank financing, giving financing to some of these companies, if they fundamentally have business models which will be at risk, that's not a good financing decision at all. So, some of the terms, so let's take the, palm oil or deforestation, for example. There's an act currently going through the EU legislation now, which does not only apply to the EU, but all companies around the world will do, including Japan, that transverse the EU, that they will have to perform diligence and actually make changes through their supply chain, whereby they have a serious impact, either from deforestation, from a palm oil perspective. Now, it doesn't make good business sense, financial sense, to lend to a company like that, because HSBC's capital will be at risk. So there is a whole narrative around. It says, yes, it's good for the planet. Yes, it's good for the S for people, but actually it makes financial sense too. So I just wanted to echo that.
Thank you both. One question I'd like to ask both of you, I guess, is because we have a lot of small companies here at the BCCJ. Is it a different story for them? Is this the responsibility of giants like yourselves and other conglomerates? What does a small business owner think about when they've got maybe 5 employees or 10 employees, or maybe they're a sole proprietorship? Is any of this relevant? Justin, either one of you. John, go ahead.
Yes, that's my answer. Yes, it is. I'll elaborate. No, absolutely. If we connect that back to the supply chain topic we talked about, quite often the smaller companies form part of a supply chain of a larger company. So what we're seeing is larger companies are requesting data through their supply chain. They're seeking to understand, whether this be from a GHG, greenhouse gas perspective, from a human rights perspective, or if they're actually systemic risk in terms of how they manufacture products. I'll give you a very specific example, and I'm trying to ensure this conversation does not get too technical, but there's a thing called CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. I think some of you are aware of this, which effectively means that if you're a company and you manage or you manufacture products, and you could be doing this as part of a broader supply chain. So we see this in automotive, for example. You may one company produced headlights, which then went to a larger company to complete car. If you manage something, you need to look at your embedded carbon on that, because if it is managed in a way which is using a lot of fossil fuels outside of the European Union. Once it goes inside, there is a tax adjustment. Now that tax adjustment could be so significant as to make their business model completely unviable in the future. So I then come back to London, 3 gaps. The first one was understanding. So if I'm a smaller company, and that's the reason why we're so keen to put out these things like the ESG Academy, because we all need to upskill ourselves, just to understand, well, what do all these things mean to me? It is a mistake for a smaller company to say that, hey, this is happening very far away, it doesn't impact me, and so on. It's coming to us all. So the answer is yes, absolutely. Small companies need to be considering that for their impact.
Yeah, absolutely agree with that. I think it is about the supply chain, as you rightly point out, right? So ultimately, I think everything. A smaller company will sell something to a bigger company that sells to a bigger company to a bigger company, right? But every company looks at the scope 3 so-called emissions, right? Which is when you talk about the environmental aspect, but essentially is what are the emissions of my what the carbon footprint of my suppliers, right? Which can go all the way down the chain. So that is very important. This does sort of come down. And when we talk about net zero transitions and net zero goals, that's an economy-wide sort of target. So it does affect everybody, including some of the smaller companies. And I think, with the example with palm oil and other things that I gave previously, similarly, behaviors of smaller companies, supply chain companies also matter, right? At some point that will be looked at from a lender, for instance, or a larger company that's ultimately their customer that's purchasing the product, right? So yeah, it does kind of sort of filter down the supply chain. But it's not to say that, of course, that it can be daunting for smaller companies. But I think everybody has to sort of do their part, their proportional part, right, of it. So I think that's how it sort of comes down.
Thank you. So I'd like to open up the floor now to questions from all of you. But I'm curious, if you could all be thinking of your questions, I'm going to ask you in a minute. Tools, because you mentioned, there's all these different things to consider, the people, the numbers, the structure of the organization. And I know there are various tools out there, like practical tools to use to get started, to start tracking and to report. Can you very briefly give us like some recommendations on where to get started on that journey, like how to find the right tool for you?
So I'll start with this. So again, as I finish the presentation, if we go back to understand, commit, and act, understand educational tools, so things like Ellen MacArthur Foundation, which is great on things like circularity. Obviously, I mentioned ESG Academy from KPMG because that effectively just collates a lot of data from some of the leading scientists around the world, so that's the understand. On the commit, what we suggest, and there are various different ways we can do this, and certainly we can send out an update afterwards, is a very, very simple gap assessment tool. So our commitment, 3 questions, is it in line with our requirements, i.e. from a reporting perspective and so on? Is it aligned with the industry and our competitors? And then the third question, is it aligned with our actual resources and capability to deliver? So we're under-committing or over-committing and so on. So it's very simple. And in terms of actions, taken action, so there was a group called the TPT, Transition Planning Task Force. They have put out a set of standards. We call this gold standards. These were announced at COP27 last year, following the group being formed at COP26 in Glasgow. And there's a lot more work coming through this, but effectively in terms of taking action, these are gold standard transition plans. So, and they are produced by industry and so on. So it's a case of getting to know that, working through these. So there's tons and tons of data and information out there. And again, we can package this up and send this through to everyone.
Yeah, I think you should talk to KPMG, get all of your tools. But instead of sort of repeating what John says, I'll take a different approach to the question. I sometimes get asked by people, this is such a, everybody's talking about it, but I feel a bit insecure, right? I don't know what this thing is. There's a lot of terms, and it's alphabet. I think you said alphabet spaghetti. I sort of say alphabet soup or something. I don't know what these things are, and I feel embarrassed, right? And I'm like, well, don't. You know, I think it's, or actually, you know, there are people starting out in their careers who say, well, I really want a career in this, and I know how important it is, and how do I upskill myself, right? So I think there's a lot of resources out there. Obviously, if you just look, there's now all sorts of certificates you can take. There's courses and other things. But a personal thing I like is actually I listen to podcasts, right? A lot of people probably do that, you know, in this room. And there's some great ones. I'm happy to recommend them to you if you're interested. But I listen to a bunch of them just to kind of keep up with this and kind of have a personal sort of education and also just to learn something new. And I like to say actually that, you know, it's sort of, for me, maybe it was about 20 years ago that I had no idea what this thing was, right? You don't study this in school or anything. There wasn't a topic called climate change or ESG or environmental science or anything like that. But now there is, but before there wasn't. So it's a new topic for everybody. And I think and you can actually skill up yourself very, very quickly, right? So not so much for, I think, the audience in this room, but if you go back and talk to your teams, your employees, or your family, or people you know, I think you should give them a message of encouragement to say that actually this is a new topic for everybody. So we're all, it's kind of a level playing field for most of us, and you can scale up very quickly. And it's one that's going to touch every sort of corner of the economy and society. So it's important to have some basic literacy of the topic, right? And that's important, but you can also get there, and there are certain ways to do that. So yeah. Don't feel discouraged if you know you hear a lot of that around you and you're like, oh, I haven't really tuned in. It's never too late to do that, right?
So we're all beginners on this on this topic. We need to wrap up now. It's that time of the morning. So I'd like to just ask last comments from you, gentlemen. Justin, maybe you can start. One piece of personal advice, one way your company can support, and where can we find you?
I'm right here. Feel free to contact me and us. I think it's just, I think as I said earlier, it's a topic that will sort of spread throughout, and I think it's important for everybody to have some basic literacy and understanding of it. So definitely be curious and learn a bit more about it. And look at it as an opportunity, right? I think at the very beginning, John, you said there's sort of people who view it as a box-ticking exercise or not. I think it is an opportunity, right? It's about how your company, your customers, your suppliers can be successful and thrive in a net zero economy, because 92% of the world's GDP is now under a net zero goal of some sort. That means everybody's on the hook for it, right? So the question is, do you make the choices for yourself and your company to be a successful company in that environment? Do you prepare early, or do you wait and see what happens, right? So I think that's just, something to keep in mind. It's sort of all throughout at the moment. Right? So.
Thank you.
Okay, I would say just similar, lean into the change. I know it's difficult, I know it's tough, but this is truly an exciting point in the history of the world, and I think we have an opportunity to do something which is truly incredible. So, and I personally feel privileged to be part of this dialogue and this whole period of change. Upskill, get ready, and how we can help ESG Academy, plus all the other things I said earlier. So over to you, Angela.
Thank you very much.